Okay, thank you. Um, so, so the food service has been sort of, whoops, this the story here, and now after a summer, a period in the summer when we had some sort of positive developments, and this is Germany, Canada, and the U.S. for restaurant dining. We've reversed course again. Germany is in a lockdown. The UK is in a similar lockdown with a lot of pubs and restaurants closed. Canada is seeing more restaurant closures, and the U.S. as well. So we're not really expecting to see this get any better over the winter months. I mean, especially with the spike that we've been seeing in the pandemic in the last few weeks. The other issue that this raises, the shutdown of food service business, is that there's a big debt overhang where the restaurants who've closed have failed to pay their suppliers. And so right now there's sort of a debt that's being carried. The US restaurant industry hoped that this would get addressed by Congress in some kind of government relief. That hasn't been the case so far, and it's unclear if that's going to happen. The danger is that this can hollow out the finances of the buyers. Already, it means that they have less access to bank credit because they're still carrying these debts on their books. But if we saw a big bankruptcy in the seafood industry from a major distributor or companies that are struggling because they can't cover these uncollected debts, we could have a big backlash that would freeze up a lot of frozen seafood purchasing. So, as I said before, the restaurant industry is not going to recover quickly. It's going to take a couple of years before we get back to where we'd like to be. So buyers, we all have to take that into account. And in a situation in coldwater shrimp, as we're going to talk about with oversupply, the fact that the food service sector is depressed is not going to help us. The other thing that's an issue here is U.S. personal income, which is now falling. In the spring, the spike in personal income due to government support really helped expand retail sales. But currently, the employment situation has not improved for many. And you can see that the personal income in total dollars is falling. So the beginning of the recovery boosted optimism for seafood distributors, but now that recovery is kind of stalled. So there's a bigger risk that temporary loss of restaurant and food service may become permanent, which means our market is smaller. There's also changes in seafood buying patterns, which have been helped by maintenance of income levels, but that is now at risk as well. So we're looking at expectations in the first and second quarter of 2021, where we're carrying a lot more risk than we would have been otherwise. The issue with shrimp in particular is that the shrimp market was weakening before the pandemic. What we've seen is that after several years where the market kind of adjusted to lower output, we have some increases in production, especially in Russia and Norway. And there was more production on the West Coast this year as well, more than expected. And so that increase in production, coupled with a weakening market trend, is what was dominating the market, and that's continued during the pandemic. So China, being one of the first countries hit by the pandemic, has sharply cut back its imports of frozen shell-on coldwater shrimp. And when you cut back on the Chinese purchasing, that leaves more of the shrimp available to go into the twice frozen market. And so, when we talked about shrimp in the past, the issue that was facing us is how much competition is there going to be from twice frozen product. And in fact, there's quite a lot. And even plants in Canada now, because of lack of raw material, have turned to producing twice frozen shrimp as well. So there's more competition between single frozen and twice frozen shrimp. The UK is buying similar volumes as in the past, but at lower prices. And we've discussed the pandemic impact. One of the things I want to show you is that the frozen seafood items have tended to be much more stable in their pricing during the pandemic than the fresh seafood items, because the fresh seafood is much more dependent on going out to a food service sector, and obviously it can't be stored, and so it has an effect on the price. And so you can see with halibut, for example, this is fresh halibut, and it's trading well below the levels that it has been in the past 3 years. Whereas coldwater shrimp, we're seeing a downward trend, but we're not seeing something that's lower than where we were, let's say, in 2017 and so forth. Cod loin, again, we see a little bit of a drop, but not a big drop. And this has to do with the fact that there's more stability in the frozen food sector. So these are some current pricing. Urner Barry has begun a European price report, which is very helpful because Globefish has stopped carrying their quotations on coldwater shrimp. So this is now a UK quote on 100 to 150 per kilo, so it's larger than our 250, 350. But you can see how the price has been dropping substantially once the pandemic hit and new season shrimp was being offered into the UK, and it's come up slightly. And in Denmark, we've seen a gradual erosion of the price in Danish kroner. The export volumes to the UK and to Denmark, and to the US, have actually recovered quite nicely compared to where they were last year. So we're not seeing a situation where the volume of coldwater shrimp going to these major markets has been cut in half. What we're seeing instead is that this is the UK, what's in green here. So the quantity of their imports from Canada have been very similar in the third quarter of 2019 and third quarter of 2020. Same thing with the US, and Denmark has increased its imports of Canadian coldwater, and these are I guess in kilos here. But you can also see that for each of these countries, the customs value in most cases is lower than where it was, although the UK seems very similar. But that's important to remember. The volumes are moving through the market. What's being affected is not the lack of supply. What's being affected is the price. The US prices have actually come down probably more than UK. And that has largely been because of West Coast fishing has been for West Coast Pandalus shrimp, which goes a lot into the US cooked and peeled coldwater market, was much more robust than was forecast earlier this year. This is just a chart of Iceland double frozen shipments to the UK, showing also that decline in price, which is now kind of stabilized. And it's basically a continuation of a trend. And the fact that our food service sector is suffering means it's hard to change direction. So the issue that we have is that our Pandalus production has sort of stabilizing after several years of growth, and the market is now kind of reached more of a balance, and any more production coming into the market tends to push down the pricing. You can see this is an estimate of global Pandalus production, how after several years of increase it's now steady, but during those years of increase the price began to erode, and that hasn't changed. So I don't have Canadian actual landing figures, but we know that there was just a minor uptick in the Gulf, and Newfoundland was about the same, and offshore shrimp will increase slightly. What I don't have the figures for is the extent to which Newfoundland producers bought Newfoundland offshore shrimp to sell into the cooked and peeled market. We know that happened. I just don't know the volume. The Oregon shrimp, we were projecting 29 million pounds at the beginning of the season in March. The actual landings were 43 million pounds. So they had a better year than projected, and that also has contributed to that weakening of prices in the US. This is just a graph of West Coast landings and value showing the increase in 2020 and the corresponding decrease in the vessel price. The real driver, I think, in the shrimp market is the increase in Norway and the Barents Sea. The volumes for Norway, I think, are projected to be around 20,000 tons. You can see that the price has been relatively stable, but this price is 13% lower because the Russian production that is being exported is going to these Norwegian plants, and it's lowering the overall price there. What's happened in the Barents Sea is a big increase in the biomass estimate, and consequently the 2020 allowable catches. So they raised, as you can see in this graph here, the allowable catches have raised by over 20,000 tons in just 1 year, and they're quite high, back up to where they were in the early 2000s. So we've seen a strong recovery in terms of what the biomass is. And the question is, how much infrastructure is available that's actually been able to harvest the shrimp this year? The Norwegian landings, I think, have been not that much higher. The Russian landings have, in fact, been higher because there's been more investment on the Russian side. Now, what's happening in the Barents Sea is that we're seeing a tendency towards colder temperatures. And we've also been seeing lower cod biomass in the Barents Sea in the last few years. And we know that there's a well-known correlation between shrimp and cod based on water temperature. And so I think that what's happening, in my opinion, is that this current colder period is helping to increase the biomass of shrimp in the Barents Sea. And that's what's driving these increases in global production. So most of that is going to be head on. Most of that does not appear to be going into the cooked and peeled market. So what we've seen is more increase in shell-on shrimp and potentially twice frozen volume compared to our inshore single frozen cooked and peeled. And most of that Barents Sea increase is going to be head-on frozen because that goes to the domestic Russian market as well. That's a very popular product in Russia. And a cooked whole frozen shrimp is going into the domestic market. So we tried to estimate where we stood in terms of cooked and peeled production. And what we're estimating is this is the volume of sort of cooked and peeled that we were projecting in the different markets, and it's relatively stable compared to 2019. But the offshore landings are much higher, and so you can see that here is the cooked and peeled production estimate on the right-hand side here. And the left-hand side is offshore production, particularly Canadian offshore. So you can see that the offshore production has been maintained, whereas the cooked and peeled has less so. If you add the Barents Sea frozen at sea production to this, you see there's a global increase in the offshore production. If we look at US production of Jordani shrimp, this is a last year's slide. For 2020, it's going to increase substantially. We saw that we have a total landings of 43 million pounds. So instead of like around 3,000 or 4,000 tons of actual cooked and peeled production, we're more likely to get 6,000 or 7,000 tons. This again is the estimates of cooked and peeled from Norway and Greenland and Iceland. It's mostly stable, and so we see a stable volume of cooked and peeled against a weakening market. So I don't think Russia impacts the cooked and peeled market that much, except for the increase that goes through Norway. In the section on snow crab, somebody asked about Russian increase in capacity. On shrimp, we have evidence that they increased the number of vessels fishing from 13 to 25. So that's in 2000. So that's a very big increase in their capacity. And you can look at the size range of the Russian landings, which tends to be smaller. But this is not the dominant feature in the cooked and peeled market. It is going to be significant in the offshore shell-on shrimp market. About Brexit, that risk, a few weeks ago, there was some concern that Canadian exports to the UK might be disrupted if there was no trade agreement in place and the UK leaves the EU without a deal. The risk of disruption is lessened because Canada and the UK have put in a deal which will preserve zero tariffs on shrimp. So there shouldn't be any worries about trade issues impacting UK demand for Canadian shrimp. But that doesn't mean there's not market worries or there's not worries about the economy of the UK going into next year. The US market, I'll just go through this very quickly. Coldwater prawns represent about 10% of the cooked market. You can see that's come up in 2019. It may come up again in 2020. The big driver in the US shrimp market is that peeled and cooked shrimp are driving the market growth, and also the larger sizes are driving the market growth. So we see an increase in warm water large sizes. We see an increase in peeled shrimp. We see an increase in cooked shrimp, cooked and peeled. And some of that is washing over to help cold water shrimp as well. Look at sources of coldwater prawns in the US. Some of it's domestic, most of it's imports. In 2020, we're going to be looking at a higher level of domestic production and probably a similar level of imports. The positive things for coldwater shrimp in the US market is the cooked shrimp trend is taking more of a market share, and cooked shrimp is also a retail product. There is a premium for wild shrimp, there's no question about that, and there's a premium for domestic shrimp in the US warm water shrimp market. In other words, Gulf domestic warm water shrimp gets a premium in the US. So coldwater shrimp can benefit from the favorable attributes of wild, domestic, and cooked. The negative things are smaller size shrimps always have lower values, and the market is demanding larger sizes. The market is on the West Coast of the US, as most people know. There was more twice frozen product in Canada. The important thing to look at here is the US shrimp consumption has gone up overall, and it's also increased in 2020. Imports are much higher than they were in the US. If we look at Europe and China, we see that increases in China, this is Argentinian shrimp, have increased in China. They've been flat in the EU. So that and in Coldwater prawns, they've increased in China, been somewhat declining in the EU and declining globally. So China is becoming a more important overall market. If I look at retail, this is the story. Shrimp has had a fantastic run at retail. We see increase in sales volumes. We see increase in percent of households buying. We see a fall in shrimp price per pound, which continued into 2020. And so what that meant is that the retailers have had a really good run on frozen shrimp. So they're a little bit tired. So we saw that in contrast to crab, where retail ads increased quite a bit, retail ads on shrimp are actually down in the current year with COVID. Imports, especially of warm water cooked shrimp, are way up. Now that's a retail product. In Canada, exports to the US are down about 20% compared to last year to date. So what's happened is that after 3 years of a very favorable price and supply situation for supermarkets for warm water shrimp, they find that promotions are less effective. So there's little incentive for them to go in and start promoting cold water shrimp or warm water shrimp, because consumers are kind of tired of the promotions and they see the price coming down and they don't respond as much. Now, in the US, the issue is, how does that affect cold water? Because if the retailers are tired of warm water, will that affect cold water? We don't see in the US much relationship between the pricing of cold water shrimp and warm water shrimp. And you can see here that as the price of warm water has declined, the price of cold water has gone up. So the cold water is responding to its own market, and the current price decline in the US, I think, is more related to the volume available than the fact that it has to compete with warm water shrimp. That's not the same in the UK. In the UK, there's a much more even correlation in usage of cold water and warm water, so that when warm water prices go down, it tends to increase consumption of warm water shrimp, and it tends to compete and flow over into competitive price pressure at the retail level with cold water shrimp. And so you can see here that cold water imports to the UK have been falling. They're stable in 2020, but warm water imports have been rising. So that's another area that's putting pressure on shrimp prices in the UK. So I think we're out of time. We have a little, maybe you could take a minute or two for questions. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I know some people may have joined us on the oyster presentation, but get to that in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, maybe we have time for 1 or 2 questions, but for all the other questions, maybe easier to send it to my colleague, Nicole Anlin. I'll just write her email in the chat now. We did have a question from Jean Lambert for you. He was just asking for a definition if cook and peel is a synonym of double frozen, or is it single frozen? I believe it can be both, but I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, it's both. You have both cooked and peeled double frozen and cooked and peeled single frozen.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
So if anybody else has a quick question we can cover now, you can write it into the chat. If not, you can email it to Nicole, which will then email it to John. Donc, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, on va probablement rapidement passer à la présentation.
If you do not have any other questions, we'll go to the presentation for oysters in a moment.